Hello, and welcome to the Finding Humanity podcast webinar series. My name is Diana Galbraith. I am the assistant producer and researcher for the podcast. Today's webinar focuses on human trafficking. We will dive into the topic of human trafficking and modern day slavery, which we cover in one of our episodes in season 2 of the Finding Humanity podcast. Before we dive into the webinar, I'll tee it over to Hazami Barmada, our host and co-executive producer, to tell us a little bit more about the podcast. Hazami is also the founder and chairperson of the Humanity Lab Foundation, an international advocacy organization working to unlock human potential and catalyze innovation to solve complex global problems. Over to you, Hazami.
Thank you so much, Diana. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce quickly the podcast. So Finding Humanity is a documentary style podcast that takes listeners to the heart of the most complex social and political problems that face our world today. In each episode, we dive in and try to peel back layers on human rights and social justice issues that are oftentimes not only complex, but also difficult to understand. This includes topics like domestic violence, genocide, racism, bullying, and many others over the course of our seasons. On our podcast, one of the things that we do is that we feature voices from the front lines of war and injustice. These are people who have lived experience on the very topics that we cover. But what we also do is we weave in insights from experts, including UN officials, high-level officials, former heads of states, world leaders, human rights champions, development experts, and scholars. And this is important because we want to make sure that we provide insights and knowledge onto the actual issues that are taking place. Finding Humanity is actually produced and co-produced by the Humanity Lab Foundation and Human Group Media. And before we go on, I'm going to go ahead and play a trailer from season 2 of our podcast.
There were negotiations going on for my release starting in the fall of 2014. I had been told several days before my release that it was happening. I'd also been told that I was set for execution, or that I'd spend the rest of my life in prison, or that, my family had been told that I died in a car accident, and they believed it.
For some, fighting for change means risking it all, including one's own life.
I remember having to climb down this ladder to get to the basement, to the clinic. She doesn't really tell me what's happening, but she, tells me to remove my underwear. And I thought that was weird. But again, she's a doctor, so I sort of didn't think too much about it. And then after it happened, after the cut, I remember sort of blacking out from the pain.
As history has taught us, fighting grave injustice requires courage, perseverance, and grit. In season 2 of the Finding Humanity podcast, we unpack the stories of people on the front lines of change. People who put their lives and bodies on the line to create a just and equitable world.
In the past, my story and my dwarfism and all the things that I was going to be sharing brought me really nothing but pain.
Bullying has serious effects that can last a lifetime in terms of the mental health and overall well-being of young people who are involved in any way.
Imagine that you live in a city. One group, they have their own legal system where they have welfare life and they have impunity. They are not accountable according to that legal system. On the other hand, Palestinians are below them legally, and we are completely suppressed and oppressed by them.
In telling the stories of those seeking justice on the front lines, Season 2 gives listeners a glimpse into the complex issues that lurk around in the darkness of our societies. We share the horrors of human trafficking, targeting and silencing of journalists, ethnic cleansing, racial inequality, and gender-based violence.
I heard long before about the dancing boys, like this practice, what is happening in this kind of environments.
Traditionally, it is meant to denote a practice in which boys and gender non-conforming people who are assigned male at birth, and these individuals are exploited. They're exploited for entertainment and gratification, particularly dancing and sex, and typically by older, more powerful men.
So gender-based violence has to be understood as violence that are committed against the person for failing to conform to social constructions of what his or her gender should be.
In media, especially in the international media, we were described as terrorists. How come a Palestinian who is attacked by Israeli settlers is a terrorist?
On the show, you will hear insights from experts from leading global human rights and social justice organizations who help deconstruct the political, social, and economic realities behind injustice. Each episode unpacks the urgent action needed to reverse the devastating impacts of human rights abuses.
There should be mandatory training of teachers and administrators. It should be a mandatory part of the curriculum that there is an anti-harassment, anti-bullying curriculum. There should be reporting requirements so parents know what's happening to their kids. Training, reporting, every state should do that.
It's important to both raise awareness on the issue, but also to invest in this healing and the trauma-informed recovery, because that's the one thing I've seen that gets shortchanged.
In this season, we aim to inspire and fuel the activist in each of us. Change is possible. Join us to help create it. Subscribe to Finding Humanity on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Our brand new season launches next week.
This webinar is actually part of our commitment to advance these conversations and inspire change. And very much want to acknowledge and thank our partners who helped make this happen: Vodafone America's Foundation and the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, in addition to the Nomi network, of which we have representatives on our webinar today. Back over to you, Diana.
All right, thank you, Hazami. Now, before I introduce our panel of experts today, I'd like to situate human trafficking in a couple of statistics. For example, 40 million people were trafficked around the world in the year 2016. 1 out of every 4 trafficked person is a child. There are 5.4 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the world. And finally, the human trafficking industry makes a profit of $150 billion a year. Of that, $99 billion comes from sexual exploitation specifically. I am very pleased to introduce our panel of experts. We will start with Catherine Bryant, who is the research manager at the Walk Free Foundation and the author of the Global Slavery Index. Catherine oversees Walk Free's policy work and programmatic responses to modern slavery. Next, we have Ilias Chatzis, who is the chief of the Human Trafficking and Migrant section at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Finally, we are joined by Diana Mao, who is the president and co-founder of Nomi Network, a 2015 presidential leadership scholar, and she served as co-chair of the Nexus Human Trafficking Modern Day Slavery Working Group. Hazami, let's circle back to you to start with. What can you tell us about the story that we tell in this particular episode, about the woman Blessing as she tells her story? What's an overview of the episode?
So I want to start by really anchoring us in the story of Blessing Okeidon, who is the person that we do interview and follow in this episode specifically. So Blessing it went from being an inspiring doctor to a woman forced into prostitution who's currently fighting with every inch of her being for victims and survivors. Blessing comes from a small village in Nigeria, but what's interesting about Blessing's story, which we want to hopefully through our podcast and all the advocacy that we're doing around it, show that it's not so interesting, it's actually extremely common, is that Blessing is challenging the perspectives that a lot of us have on who is trafficked and why. Blessing is actually a woman from a faith-based community, a Christian community, who was recruited and trafficked through a member of her church. She was promised a job in Europe as a computer engineer and fell in the hands of human traffickers in Italy. And what we're doing through this episode specifically is really trying to challenge a better understanding of who the face is of modern slavery. Is there a face of modern slavery? And hopefully your takeaway is that there is not. But we're also trying to really understand the root causes of modern day slavery. Why is it happening? Why are we not making more progress? Why are more people not being held accountable for the atrocities that they're committing? Why is it so hard, for example, to get justice for victims? And more importantly, also, what type of support do victims need and how can we better advocate for that? We're really excited that in this episode specifically, we do feature the voices of two experts who are with us today, Ilias and Catherine, that you introduced, Diana. But we also have a segment from Gracia Michel, who is an international advocate for women and girls' rights and children's rights specifically, but she's also a founding member of the Elders, which she founded alongside her husband, Nelson Mandela. And we're really proud to have partnered and continue to partner with the Elders on various other episodes. So I'm going to go on ahead and play an audiogram of Blessing's episode to give you a little bit of a taste of her voice from her perspective also.
If I resist them, something bad can happen to me immediately because I already know that I have fallen into the den of criminals. I was broken. I do not see myself as a person. I have totally lost my freedom.
The lack of education, the lack of opportunities, the lack of financial means, social prejudices, all of these create an additional layer that makes them more vulnerable to become trafficking victims.
There are lots of factors that prevent individuals from wanting to come forward and wanting to identify themselves. You know, we're talking about a business at the end of the day that profits from the exploitation of these individuals.
I think the way it is being dealt with is soft and it's not coordinated. We need to be severe in where we punish those who are involved in this.
Back over to you, Diana.
All right, Hazami, thank you. Let's go over to Ilias. Actually, Ilias, can you just give us a definition of human trafficking and maybe provide some examples of the kinds of different human trafficking?
Thank you very much for inviting me today, and congratulations on the series that you have launched. I wouldn't like to stick to the criminal law definition of human trafficking, but because I think it is quite important that people understand what it is in real life and how it manifests itself. And human trafficking is a story of Blessing that we heard. It's a story also of women that have been forced into prostitution without any sort of concern about their well-being or their health. It's a story of the construction worker that is forced to work under scorching heat with no safety and with no pay. It's a story of the child that is forced to beg in the streets and is kept at the limits of starvation. It's the story of the farmer that is forced to sell his kidney because he's been told that nothing wrong will happen to his health because he has two and he can spare one, and then he can pay off his increasing debt because of the bad crop he's had. Human trafficking does not necessarily involve violence and does not necessarily involve the privation of liberty. It can happen also up in the open because people are usually so much in control of the traffickers that they cannot easily escape. You cannot easily escape from your debtor that is a heavy criminal and knows where to find you and knows where to find your family. At the same time, also, it's so abhorrent as a crime, it's so awful as a crime that the law says that there can be no consent to it. So if the trafficker goes to court and says, well, I have an agreement, they signed a contract, the new laws come to them. This is null and void if it's a trafficking case. And this is the law. Also, it's very important to know that trafficking does not happen in foreign places. It happens everywhere. And it happens also within families, and it happens within social surroundings of the people that are trafficked. We did a study where we're looking into forced marriages, and we had girls as young as 12 being married by their families, and brought into situations that ended up basically in sexual abuse for the rest of their lives. So this is what trafficking is.
Those are really powerful examples, Ilias. Thank you for really driving home for us the personal, specific, individual impact that trafficking has. And it sounds like it's not just such sexual trafficking. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word trafficking, they might think about exploitation sexually, but it turns out there's labor exploitation, child exploitation. And it's just so powerful to hear those personal anecdotes. So thank you for that. And on a related subject, Catherine, I'd like to ask you a bit about the language that we use to talk about trafficking. The title of the report that you published is the Global Slavery Index, I'm curious about why you use the word slavery instead of the word trafficking.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you so much for having me to join you today to talk about this really important issue. So we at Walk Free, the organisation that I work at, use the term modern slavery when we're talking about these forms of exploitation. And we use modern slavery as an umbrella term that encompasses many different types of exploitation that come from international legal definitions. So we look at human trafficking, forced labour, forced marriage, and slavery as coming under this umbrella term of modern slavery. But common to all of these forms of exploitation are situations of exploitation where the individual is unable to leave or refuse. And that might be because of threats, because of physical violence, because of some form of deception or coercion. So this is what we mean when we talk about modern slavery in kind of an operational sense. But I really like what Ilias was saying about, ultimately, this is obviously a dry legal definition that we use to inform our research at Walk Free, but ultimately we're talking about individuals who are being exploited in these really extreme forms. So you can see, for example, the 40.3 million people who are affected about this around the world in your introduction, Diana. Within that, there are people who are forced to labour in construction, agriculture, women and girls who are forced to marry someone who perhaps they didn't consent to, or even domestic workers forced to work in private homes. One thing I also just want to quickly draw attention to is the real gendered element of this. So of that 40.3 million figure, we estimate 70% of them are actually women and girls. If you put that another way, it's actually 1 in 130 females globally is in some form of modern slavery, which is truly shocking. So when we're talking about modern slavery, it is important to remember there is a kind of gender element to this.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. That is such an important point to make. And so what I'm hearing from you is that trafficking is really one form of modern slavery. It's just sort of one component. And again, I think that when people hear trafficking, they're only thinking of, oh, somebody was kidnapped or trafficked to another country, but that's really not the case. And you mentioned briefly the legal aspect of trafficking, and it does sound like there are legal mechanisms in place designed to help victims, but maybe they're not always as powerful or helpful as we would like them to be. Can you talk a little bit about how that works or doesn't work?
Exactly, no. So in lots of countries, these forms of modern slavery, of which human trafficking is one, are criminalized. So there is a criminal justice mechanism in response to this. And so that means that perpetrators can be arrested, can be prosecuted based on their involvement in these crimes. Lots of these trafficking legislation in particular also provide protections for victims in law. So they provide access to either shelter or protections for individuals such as returning to their home country. But what we find through our research at Walk Free is, although these things might exist in paper in some countries, they're either not being implemented or there are gaps in that legislation. So we found that lots of countries have actually criminalized human trafficking, for example, but aren't necessarily then providing support to police to investigate these crimes or training to prosecutors. So there definitely isn't a really strong response to trafficking and other forms of modern slavery around the world today. Oh, you're just on mute, Diane.
Excuse me for being on mute. It sounds like that's kind of a role that your organization tries to fill a little bit, Catherine, to at least provide information to policymakers, which hopefully can be one of the responses to trafficking. And I'd like to move over to Diana, actually. Diana, I know you've talked a lot in your work about the reasons people become susceptible to modern slavery, part of which has to do with economics. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of piggybacking off of Ilias and Catherine, speaking from kind of the global slavery index perspective, half the world population of those in slavery are estimated to reside in India, approximately. And so we work in India and we see just the difference $1 a day versus $3 a day makes. To us, it's $1 versus $3, but to women that are living in desolate communities without access to running water or electricity, they make decisions every day for survival. And so the decision to start the matchmaking process for their daughter at the age of 12 years old, puts a child at immense risk because most likely she is being married into a family that practices intergenerational prostitution or domestic servitude or some sort of abuse at that age. And so for us, we really see economic empowerment and economic stability as critical in the fight against human trafficking, because we see that women that have access to basic income as well as financial security actually desire to continue their education. Many of the women that we serve in rural India, Bihar, one of the poorest regions in India, have not even finished the 5th grade standard. And so because of these vicious cycles in these communities, we see that income really impacts the next generation and allows women and gives them the wherewithal to select that their children are educated and continue their education, as well as have adequate school supplies, have school uniforms, et cetera, et cetera.
It's so powerful that you mentioned gender and how deeply affected women are by trafficking and slavery, and which sort of ties back to what Catherine was talking about, with roughly 70%, of course, of trafficking and slavery victims being women. Now, we talk a lot about international trafficking and slavery. You've also done some work on domestic trafficking in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that looks like?
Yeah, my eyes became awakened to the issue in the U.S. when 2 years ago I was brought by one of our major partners to a juvenile detention center. And at that center, I met girls 13 to 17 years old. About 40% of them were prostituted. So they were brought in on counts of prostitution. And thankfully at the center, they're being rehabilitated and not treated as criminals. And so with that, I just realized in the US, we started the journey of Nomi Network globally because of my personal experiences living in India and Cambodia. And the numbers, yes, there are greater, higher levels of human trafficking in some of these countries that have poor rule of law or high levels of corruption. But in the United States, I would say there are many systems, particularly in child welfare, that's a bleeding hole into slavery and into human trafficking. So for example, children aging out of foster care, runaway youth, homeless youth. According to Covenant House, there are 3 million homeless youth in the United States today. And according to the FBI, within 10 minutes that a female girl is on the street, she is solicited for sex, and the likelihood of her being trafficked just increases as she's on the streets day by day.
Got it. So we see trafficking and slavery in the US, but sometimes it takes a different form from what we see overseas. That's really interesting. Speaking of rehabilitation, Hazami, which is part of Blessing's story, actually, can you tell us more about why you chose to tell Blessing's story?
In the process of finding stories, one of the things that we really try to do at the Finding Humanity podcast is to make sure that we humanize people. I think one of the issues that comes up often in our podcast is this idea of re-triggering. When you're asking people to tell their stories and they've gone through so much grave injustice, and yet again, they carry the burden of re-sharing their story to get people to care. And one of the things that we notice with our podcast too is that people are overwhelmed with apathy. When you hear numbers like 40.3 million people are trafficked around us, when you hear stories like Diana just shared, they're right here in the United States. I'm currently in Washington, DC, and Washington is a hub of human trafficking, but we often don't identify it as such. I think that's where it becomes really important to humanize the plight of someone who's going through that injustice, to actually understand from them. Because very unfortunately, when I first started digging into, for the preparation of this podcast, there's oftentimes a lot of victim blaming. A girl should have known better. Why would you have allowed yourself to do that? Why did you dress a certain way? Why did you choose to take a certain job? Why do parents choose to put their children into child labor? And so there's oftentimes a lot of the very issues that we're trying to tackle when you look at how the public narrative is often portrayed, it's actually not only re-victimizing people, but a lot of the blame is actually pivoted onto the very people that are in these systems of injustice to begin with. So in telling the story of Blessing, what was really important for us was to put a face on just the passion that this woman had, but also allow her to share her own story. We oftentimes talk about giving a voice to the voiceless. I personally believe there's not a single person in this world who's voiceless. People have voices. They're using them. We're just not listening. We're not hearing it. We're not giving them the platforms to share their own stories and to actually advocate for their own solutions. And I think that's why it's really important to tell stories like Blessings, because not only is she someone who's lived through this experience, but she's using her experience to now turn around, not only to challenge the system, but to challenge perceptions of what we all have, not only with regards to what's happening around us, but our individual roles in it. You know, where we choose to spend our money, whether we choose to go to the nail salon or not. You know, the reality is, and you all talked about statistics, there are consumers who are on the receiving end of every single statistic we talked about today. You talked, Diana, about the wealth of the industry. And who are all these buyers? And where are all these buyers? And why is there not more public scrutiny and criticism and shame that is being attributed to these buyers instead of the shame that's being put on those who become victims of the system? And so Blessing's story really digs into some of the moral and ethical issues that I think oftentimes we don't have nuanced conversation around in the discourse that we're having. And I'll leave it at that, Diana.
Those are very powerful points, Azami. Thank you for that. And I would like to talk a little bit about the geography of trafficking and slavery. So let's go back to Ilias. Ilias, what can you tell us about maybe hotspots in the world for trafficking? Where do we see more trafficking? Where do we see less trafficking?
Thanks. I would not say that there are hotspots. This may be a bit misleading because you may give the impressions that trafficking happens more in some parts of the world and less in other parts of the world, which is an often misconception. A lot of people think that trafficking happens only in developing countries or in the less, wealthy ones, and it doesn't happen in the Western and affluent countries, which is it's wrong perception. Also, the size of trafficking, we should not forget that can be also the result of good investigations and good prosecutions. So high numbers are not only a demonstration of more crime, but it can be a demonstration also of better investigations and better prosecutions on the crime. So there's a mixed, bag here of things. Trafficking happens everywhere. It's so multifaceted. It comes out in so many different forms, from forced labor to slavery to sexual exploitation to organ trafficking to forced begging to forced marriages to the traditional forms of slavery, the more known to us. That it happens everywhere, and it's that we collect data from across the world. And this in the last report we issued, we collected report from 150 countries out of 193 of the world, and some of them, simply did not provide us with any data. So there is hardly a country in the world where it's a trafficking case reported. Now, I want to stress the fact that it's not the problem of the least developed countries, of the less, the countries that are not wealthy. Actually, the wealthy countries and the developed countries have much more responsibility. They have more resources to put into it, and they have also an increased responsibility because they are often destination countries when the trafficking is transnational and transregional, because all the flows are actually from the low-income countries to the high-income countries when we're talking about cross-border countries. Like within a country also, it's from poorer regions in the country to the wealthy regions of the country. So it happens everywhere. No one is immune to it. And you heard the story of Blessing, how it all started. It doesn't happen only to uneducated or poor people. It happens also to educated and people that have the means at the beginning of their life. But I would also like to add one point, that trafficking is also a very gendered crime. And women are the majority of victims globally for us, but it also affects men to a large extent, and it affects boys to a large extent. In the last 15 years, we see the number of boys detected globally, it's 5 times higher than it was. It has, it became 5 times bigger. Girls became also 3 times bigger. So it affects everyone differently. Sexual exploitation is mostly women. 90% of the women trafficking victims have been tried for sexual exploitation. Forced labor is men. Forced begging, it increasingly affects children. So it's very gendered. It happens everywhere. And I don't think we can say that there is any country that it's immune to this problem. I think this has been politically recognized. The problem is that not a lot of the countries turn their words into deeds. Thank you.
It's a great point. Thank you for mentioning that trafficking is not just a problem for lesser developed nations. We have to look at the developed world as well. And I wonder, because Blessing was trafficked from Africa to Europe, what can you tell us about what trafficking looks like in Europe?
Thank you. There is the European Union has a very a good statistical agency on with very detailed data for trafficking in Europe. In Europe, most of the trafficking victims are actually EU citizens, European Union citizens. They're not foreigners that have migrants that have been smuggled in or have come in the country. However, the migrant globally, the migrant population percentage of trafficking victims is increasing, and actually. In the latest report we had in Central and Southern Europe, 65% of victims have been migrants. So there's a huge vulnerability of the migrant population in Europe. Most of it is coming from Africa, but also from other regions of the world, Latin America, Asia, and also the Middle East. Unfortunately, geographical distances are no longer a problem for trafficking networks. Trafficking is then very much entangled with migrant smuggling. And you have these 2 crimes, unfortunately, mixed along the way, which makes it extremely difficult to distinguish how to go about it, who to prosecute, who is the victim, and who needs protection, who not. So for the countries, especially along the way, the transit countries, it becomes an extremely difficult situation to handle.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that it's really a global phenomenon, and you can't easily divide it into one country versus another because it seems to sort of cross borders a great deal. And speaking of international trafficking, I'd like to move back to Diana. Diana, you did talk a little bit about this, but why is it so important that we challenge the idea that trafficking only happens globally? Why is it so important to talk about trafficking and slavery inside the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to really look at the conditions in which one becomes enslaved. And I think just to add on to Ilias, you know, what we saw in India with the increase of men being more susceptible to human trafficking was during the COVID shutdown in India. You had thousands of migrant workers by foot having to walk more than 1,000 miles to the north where we have a training center. And they ended up on our doorsteps. We don't currently serve men, we focus on women and girls, but they ended up on our doorstep desperate and hungry, and some with COVID. And so you see more and more vulnerabilities. In the United States, I mentioned the stat on 3 million homeless youth. And these are not just statistics, these are human beings, you know, cases where a girl, you know, her mother makes $1,000 a month cleaning homes in Texas. And she brings in these questionable male figures, boyfriends, who sexually abused her. And then now she ended up in detention because she ran away for survival. And so these are survival individuals that are really operating in survival mode. And I think these people, we cannot forget them because they exist in our own country. And I think it's very easy to look at India. It's very easy to look at, you know, the continent of Africa and other places. But when we open our eyes, you know, it's really all around us. I mean, just go to a restaurant alone, and if you're paying, you know, $5 for a meal, can't help but to ask yourself, how much is the dish, you know, the dishwasher making? How much is the waiter making? You just do the math. And Hazimi touched upon the economics of human trafficking. Well, I will say, you know, we do need to take a deeper dive into the economics of slavery and really think about the pricing, the model behind this huge engine.
That's pretty overwhelming, Diana. Thank you for that context. And speaking of sort of falling victim to the system, Catherine, what needs to happen? What needs to happen at the policy level? what can advocates actually do to try to sort of interfere and stop this cycle?
I think the key thing is recognizing that we all have a role to play in eradicating modern slavery. Like, everyone has some action they can take to actually combat these issues. So if you take the policy level, look at government responses to this, at Walk Free, we assess what governments are doing across 183 countries, and we've identified what constitutes a strong government response, and this encapsulates criminal justice mechanisms, supporting survivors, and also engaging with business. And we found that actually, as I mentioned earlier, like, lots of governments have legislation on their books, but they're not implementing that. So there's a real need for governments to make sure that they focus on this within their policy making, to make sure they are reviewing their legislation, to make sure they're drawing on the great work of Ilias at UNODC to actually strengthen and provide training to prosecutors and police, etc. I also think Diana mentioned a really important point, that although criminal justice response is one element of this, it's also really important that we're putting in place social protection floors for individuals so they don't fall through the cracks in general, but also post-COVID. So that means, making sure there is a minimum wage, and that is applying to all workers, and that migrant workers are also able to access labor protections through a strengthening of labor laws. So that's looking very much kind of at the policy and government level. I think there's also a really important role for business and investors on this piece, and that's something that's really picked up in recent years. Businesses are recognizing through the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that they have a responsibility to protect workers within their own companies, within their own business, but also within the supply chains of the goods that they're selling or the services that they're providing. So there's a real role for business in this. And then just recently, we at Walk Free released a report looking at the role of investors. And we can see that investors actually have a really important role to play by asking the businesses that they're investing in what they're actually doing to tackle modern slavery. So that's something that's super important as well. And then bringing it all the way down to the individual. Hazima said about the role of consumers, and making sure that we're actually thinking through the goods that we're buying, the services that we're purchasing, and thinking through who made my clothes, who was involved in that supply chain, and asking questions of the brands that we purchase from to make sure they are actually respecting human rights and that they are protecting the workers within their supply chain. So I think there's a role for everybody. It's a very complex issue, but I think there are some solutions out there.
Well, it's good to hear that there are some solutions. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that it's really a holistic response. It's not just about having a legal framework in place. It's not just about individual consumers making choices. So that's a very interesting perspective to give us on that. I'd like to move back to Hazami for a minute. Going back to Blessing's story, why is it so important for our podcast, for the Humanity Lab Foundation, to make stories like Blessing's more accessible to the general public?
I think I'd actually echo what a lot of people are saying, and further that by saying it's actually overwhelming and daunting. I am someone who has dedicated my life to human rights advocacy. I've been studying policy for the past decade, 15 plus years. And I'm still really struggling to wrap my head around what does sustainable solutions look like. And these conversations, especially with the Finding Humanity podcast, we don't have answers. We're not coming and telling you, do 1, 2, 3, 4, because as you've heard on this call, there are multiple needs on so many fronts, training and employment opportunities and policy reform, business compliance. We heard about kind of consumer responsibility, and the intersectionality of all these issues to your average person just feels so daunting, to where again, as I mentioned earlier, people are just like, well, I can't do anything because it's so overwhelming and it's all around us. But we truly at the podcast believe that knowledge is power. And with information on how these systems work or don't work, we can actually become not only better allies, but support in the small ways that we can. Because what we don't want is this cripplingly large, daunting issue to be the reason why people say, oh, it's too big, I'm insignificant. You are not insignificant. And so what we do, not only with the podcast, but in the advocacy work, is try to make change accessible. Because the reality is, all of human trafficking is fueled, and modern day slavery in all of its forms is fueled because there's a market for it. It's being enabled, it's happening. So some parts of our society, whether it's our social norms, cultural norms, looking at issues like racism and discrimination and homophobia and all these various issues that do riddle, unfortunately, our discourse, our social narratives, have a really large role to play. And I want to specifically talk about intersectionality of issues. We're hearing oftentimes, these issues in isolation of one another, but we cannot, for example, remove poverty when we try to understand who falls in the hands of human trafficking and so on and so forth. Increasingly also, as Ilias mentioned, you mentioned that the market for young boys is also growing. This is not a gendered issue, as all of you have said, it's a human rights issue. And so I think oftentimes in how we tell human trafficking stories, it makes them harder for people to relate to because they're just overwhelmed with information. So what we do at the podcast is we like to inspire and provoke what we call intellectual curiosity. We're not giving you answers. We're hopefully getting you to be more aware, ask better questions, and be more cognizant to what's happening around you in your societies, in your communities, because this is happening around us, quite frankly. It's not hidden. And the podcast really reveals that. It literally is all around. So we do have an education toolkit that we create that we do distribute with each episode. And the toolkit actually really unpacks these issues. And I'm seeing in the chat, people are talking about, the terms slavery, human trafficking, and Diana mentioned it too. We actually go into all of this in the toolkit where we really want people to understand what is happening. And again, we don't have answers, but we also want people to ask, what is not happening? Why do we not have regulations? Why is there not more international cooperation? What's going on and what could we do to fix it? And so that the knowledge of what's not happening is as important for us as what's happening.
I completely agree. And speaking of things not happening in response to trafficking, Ilias, I'm curious to get your opinion on sort of where are we when it comes to responding to trafficking? Are the things that we're doing making a difference? Are we falling behind globally? What needs to change?
Thanks. I'm going to make an argument that's going to be difficult to make, but I will make it. There is progress. It's very slow and it's not enough. The crime did not even exist 20 years ago. And 20 years is not a very long time in international law and in criminal law. 20 years ago, we had no victim protection measures. This debate that we have now wouldn't have taken place. A number of countries, political leaderships, people are becoming more aware of the crime. So this is the positive thing. People are looking, on where their money go. Companies are afraid of public shame, if they found their supply chains to be dirty. I'm sorry to say the word, with trafficking chains. So there are things that have moved on, but we're not where we're supposed to be. And I think one of the reasons is the fact that there's a lot of things here that we need to unpack. And if we unpack them all together, it becomes a bit confusing. And I think that was what Hazami was alluding to. There is a lot of things to look at. And we have, the underlying issue, you have the poverty, the gender discrimination, lack of education, you have the huge discrepancy between the countries. You have, a doctor in a least developed country that looks on the TV that now, or somewhere else on social media, wherever, doctors in other countries that have other lives. They say, well, I'm educated, why can I not have the same life? I can go there, I'll find my way there. So there's a lot of things to do. In my view, we need to take one step at a time. And for me, the first one is regulation. The crime needs to be identified properly. It needs to be criminalized. There needs to be prosecutions. There needs to be consequences for the perpetrators. There needs to be assistance for the victims. And then in the longer term, we need to look at our system, the financial model that our development is based on. The cheaper, the faster, the things that last very short, and then we throw them away, we get new ones. All of these things require cheap labor. Without these things, you cannot have the standards of life we have. So we have two things. One thing is the immediate attention that we need to pay. And for me, where we need to look at first is basically to make sure that the crime is investigated, it's prosecuted effectively. People do serve times, they do not walk away with simple fines, that the rights of the victims are not ignored. And these are at the level where we have done some progress, and we just need to strengthen it. We just need to bring it up to the level we need. And then we need, as a societies, to look into the deeper causes that lead to the need to people become so desperate that they could become victims of trafficking. Allow me to say something else. We often talk about the vulnerability of victims. Sometimes I feel like we're putting another burden on the victims not to become victims, which is not fair. I think what we should be looking at is systems that do not allow exploitation, not people that do not, allow themselves to be tricked or be, coerced or being abused. We have to look at establishing the system, and that goes also for the private sector. And my answer to this is that we need more regulation. The consumer, which is at the end of this line, has a responsibility, but it cannot be on the individual consumer the responsibility to end human trafficking. It has to be with the authorities. There has to be regulation, and there has to be consequences for countries that do not do their work and do not clean the supply chain. Thank you.
It sounds like we are making We are making progress with human trafficking. We have more awareness, we have more legal systems, but we also have more work to be done, and there's a lot more room for enforcement. We have a couple of audience questions. One comes from the Philippines, from the Muslim Mindanao areas. We have a lot of challenges here in the Philippines in terms of internet connectivity and access to justice for Indigenous communities. Are there any best practices for community engagement in remote areas? So let's just open it up to anyone who has thoughts on that.
I can maybe get started. Some of the work I've done previously is looking at evaluations of existing programs. So programs implemented by either NGOs or international organizations. And through that work, we've actually looked at a few successful programs about community empowerment models in particular. So I'd point to the work of an organization called the Freedom Fund, which is actually based here in London, but also in New York. And they've done an awful lot of work in remote communities in southern and northern India to try and look at how they can empower communities around human rights-based education to provide them with the tools to prevent them from becoming exploited. So that would be just one idea to look at the Freedom Funds and their work.
Got it. So there are some organizations reaching out to the more remote areas. That is good to hear. Let's see. Yes, go ahead.
Could I say, because that's a very interesting question, and we actually have been, as we speak, we're doing actually a data jam with ABM in Canada, looking at Indigenous communities, trafficking in persons, say the LGBTQI community also. So what Catherine said is very important, because discriminalization and lack of opportunities at the heart of trafficking, because it's these communities that have become more vulnerable to being trafficked. So yes, there needs to be more attention to Indigenous communities. There needs to be more attention also to groups within our societies that are more vulnerable. Thank you.
I just add one more thing. Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I know Vodafone America Foundation is a supporter of this podcast, and actually 2 years ago we started the digitalization process of our curriculum, and thankfully, very timely, we were able to really deploy it across all of our sites. And so empowering the rural communities, women that can't even sign their names are now coordinating relief efforts across India and in the most remote areas. So I do think digitalization is very important, especially for not-for-profits that really serve the last mile communities. It's critical, especially when it comes to natural disasters or COVID-19.
Speaking of COVID-19, I'd like to ask a general question to everyone. How has the global pandemic affected trafficking and slavery? What changes have we seen? What challenges have arisen?
I'm happy to start again, but I think the key thing for us is that COVID-19, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that's facing the anti-slavery movement at the moment. And we've seen definitely a worsening of modern slavery as a result of the pandemic. And this takes many forms. We were talking earlier about some of the migrant workers who become vulnerable to exploitation as a result of the pandemic. In India, we saw the migrants moving, having lost their jobs, huge numbers of individuals forced to flee where they were working to go back to their home communities, which then created additional pressures on the community resources. We saw also migrant workers in some of the Gulf states and other places that perhaps weren't able to get home and then were locked in situations of exploitation. Domestic workers are a particularly vulnerable group. Now that everyone is staying at home all the time, if they're experiencing that kinds of abuse, then that situation is exacerbated. I think also beyond the individuals who are experiencing these forms of exploitation, I'm really concerned about a setback to the progress that Ilias was talking about earlier. There has been an improvement since the year 2000 when the trafficking protocol was put in place, but I'm worried that any of those gains that we've made may be lost or maybe refocused as we kind of focus on the immediate response to the pandemic. And one thing I think we can take away from this is that it's really important to notice that this is kind of, as we were talking about earlier, the intersectionality of this issue, that we shouldn't just be focusing just on the pandemic, but we should be also thinking about the people that were vulnerable to the pandemic in the first place and look at opportunities that this gives us to actually build back better, to make sure that we are providing those protections for those that are the most vulnerable to these most severe forms of exploitation.
If I may add something to this one.
Yes.
I think we need to look also very carefully, hopefully when this pandemic is over and we're able to collect solid data, we really need to collect the data to see what really has happened. We haven't learned from previous epidemics. We didn't learn from SARS in Asia, we didn't learn from the Ebola, we didn't learn from Zika in Brazil. This would have been, we should have looked what was the effect on crime of these regional epidemics, because they covered large parts of our world. So we have to learn from this one. We're actually doing a study right now that covers more than 50 countries, and we're actually collecting data to see what has been the response of the impact of of COVID on trafficking. And in addition to what Catherine has said, for us, it has been also very worrying the fact that justice system slowed down or just stopped. Court cases did not proceed. Victim assistance services were not functioning. Social workers could not reach their victims that were basically, were locked in an apartment. Trafficking victims that were in trafficking situations, and you may have seen press reports, found in horrible situations because of the lockdowns. They couldn't go out. In many countries, the police had a very heavy-handed approach. Also, don't forget, during the lockdowns, which did not encourage people to go out and seek help for this. So we had a very bad situation, and we hope to be able to bring some of this forward with this study. But I think collectively we really need to look more thoroughly into this, when the pandemic is over, and really collect the data and see where it has taken us. And also we should look for the future. In the past, economic crisis has always led to more trafficking cases, and we have data that have showed that it has affected a lot of countries that had been hit by especially by the economic crisis of 2008, 2010. So this is also our fear for the future. Thank you.
Let's continue, actually. Let's continue along that vein. And Ilias, I'd like to continue with you. We have an audience question. We are wondering how we can strengthen legislation. And I know that there is a lot of legislation in Europe in place. What do we need to do to make it more effective?
Implement. And I think both Catherine and Diana also mentioned, something that stays on paper is worthless. And I think if I remember correctly, more than 90% of countries around the world have anti-trafficking legislation in place. So 9 out of countries have the legal tools. They may not be perfect, they may not be ideal, but they have the legal tools to investigate and prosecute. So the question is, why this is not happening? And this is not happening because the crime is complicated, like we discussed. So police officers, judges, prosecutors, and the judiciary do not really understand the crime very often. So they need to dwell into its many elements and understand how it manifests itself, that the victim that could leave the trafficker but did not leave doesn't mean that it was with her or his consent that stayed there and they had an agreement, so it was just simple bad working conditions. That the crime needs to be identified for its elements and be prosecuted accordingly, so people do not walk away for a labor infraction simply, with an administrative fine. So there needs to be more awareness of the crime itself and how it manifests itself. And this is an uphill battle because the crime also changes a lot. During COVID, it becomes more online. A lot of countries do not have the tools to investigate. Many of the platforms that these conversations happen are held by private companies, and the private companies are not very willing to share information with law enforcement. Like it could be, for example, your state-run telephone company in the past, where you could have very specific provisions. How do you wiretap? How do you do this thing? You cannot do these things easily with WhatsApp or with other platforms. So there are huge challenges also in how the crime develops and evolves.
Yes, so let's continue on that theme and move back to Diana. One of the issues I think we face is that victims often don't feel like they can speak up and talk about what happened and report it to authorities. Is there anything we can do to change that or encourage people to feel more comfortable?
Yeah, I would say legal training. We offer that in rural India where women and girls don't know their rights. They're seen, by the community because of the caste system, no better than a dog. And so really that training is critical, that they understand their rights. One example, case in point, alcoholism was so bad in the state of Bihar at one point a few years ago that state banned alcohol. And they saw, because alcohol correlated with domestic violence, a lot of women did not know about the ban. And so when their husbands would abuse them, they would come to our office, and through the training, they were empowered to go report to law enforcement that their husband had alcohol. And so under that count, they were brought in, and there was some reform that happened in that region. So that's just, one example. Another is just really knowing that when, sadly, there's been murder cases that we've represented our clients and won a few cases, the murder of a 12-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl in the state of Bihar as well. And so really being empowered to report the case and having the support system to proceed with the case and getting justice is really critical. And that's where local grassroots organizations have such a strong influence. And that's where we really need to empower these local communities to stand. And even in the United States, the recent cases of AAPI violence, talking to my friend Richard Louie, who is with MSNBC, it's so difficult to really empower communities to report these hate crimes, even in the United States of America. And so even in these ethnic pockets where individuals may know their rights, but they're conditioned not to speak up, their voice really carries such power when it is brought to the light.
I agree completely. And I feel like our conversation could keep going and going, but unfortunately we have a time limit. So let's go back to something actually that Blessing said at the end of the episode. She said, we all have the right to live a better life. Let's do a really quick round. Let's all say one thing that the audience can do to make a difference in trafficking, and then we'll wrap up. Diana, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I will say immediately top of mind right now is, there are so many individuals in the United States, and I know we're speaking to a global audience, so this is reflective of your own community. I would say be a mentor. There are people right in your neighborhood, and I would say bring it back to this level. I know so many times we focus on systems, and that is very important. And I know there are people like Ilias working on that. But for me, it's about the individual person. And so I would say just lift up 3 or 4 people around you, and that just carries so much weight. If everyone did that, myself and my team, we're committed to mentoring survivors in the US, as well as providing them with internship opportunities. So if you're a corporate leader, really kind of try to pave the way for someone that you perhaps normally wouldn't hire, but I would encourage you to really look into just, how to lift someone up and give them an opportunity within your own company and ecosystem.
That's fantastic. Catherine, what are your 2 cents on what our audience can do?
I think for me that the main thing is ask questions. and ask questions of all of those who have a role to play in this fight against modern slavery. So ask questions of your favorite clothes brands. Who made my clothes? Where did these come from? Who was involved in the manufacture of the phone that I use as well? Ask questions of your local government, of your national government, what they're doing to respond to these crimes. You know, do they have legislation in place? And then ask questions of local NGOs of how you can support, you know, what resources you can provide, or volunteering opportunities. So yeah, ask questions and kind of educate yourself on these particular issues.
And Ilias, what would you like to say?
I would be on the same line with my colleagues here, and I think that those of you that are politically active, use your power, write to your local representative, write to your local chief of police, write to your member in parliament, write, you know, to the people that have, you know, a power. Make sure that it's still on the agenda, that it's high on the agenda, and the attention that it deserves, you know, is given to this issue.
And finally, let's loop in Hazami. What would you like to contribute?
I think similarly. I mean, I think definitely listen and share information. Our podcast was really created to give people a starting point for that conversation. So please do listen, please do share. And as I said earlier, knowledge is power. And we start to dismantle systems of oppression by recognizing how and why they are the way they are. And so start with that. Even if you're knowledgeable, there's always something to learn. And we have amazing experts on this call who have contributed a lot to the toolkits and then to the podcast, but also do amazing advocacy. So follow people working on this and be an advocate to amplify what they're already doing. It doesn't take much time.
All right, everyone, we are out of time. I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank our viewers, our partners, and our sponsors. Please stay in touch with the podcast via our website. Thank you so much for joining.